He has created a symphony of faith throughout history, but we don't see the full picture. We don't see all of the details just yet. We see God's redemptive plan of restoring brother to brothers and father and mother to their son, but we don't hear it all at once. When we take and pause in the middle like this and we get a portion of the story, we see just a glimmer of the worship that God has planned. I've talked about my son Nathaniel many times, and my son Nathaniel has this odd quirk about him. He likes weird music, and not just weird music, he likes weird instruments. He has this piano type thing that you blow into and you play the piano, and it's almost like an organ, but it's not. But you gotta get the music flowing through it. And then he decided that he was gonna learn the nose flute. Have you ever seen a nose flute? You use your mouth as the music box and you blow through your nose and it creates this whistle. It's really weird. His most recent acquisition was a mandolin from the 1920s. And all of these things seem very surprising to us. But the thing that surprised me most about music is that my daughter this past week had never heard that I had played tuba in high school. I don't. I would think that the unique instruments that my son plays would be more surprising than the fact that I would rock a tuba in high school. I found that interesting because you don't often hear about tuba solos anywhere. Their main purpose and intention is to keep a steady rhythm and keep the same note as much as possible. To note the changes in key and in chords throughout the playing of the song. I once took my tuba from my house, which was an ordeal, but thankfully we had a large trunk at the time, and I was able to place the tuba inside the trunk, and I took it to church. And I shared a song with people. And I was told to stop because I was way too loud, and nobody could really understand what I was playing. I thought I was playing a Christmas song, and they couldn't tell. Mainly because when you remove an instrument from the orchestra, you don't get to hear the full song. When you take yourself away from understanding God's symphony of faith, and you live in a hovel by yourself, it is hard to see how God is moving and acting. It's hard to join in the symphony of worship by having faith in a group when you separate yourself from them. We are in the midst of this true story of Joseph and his brothers and God's redemptive plan. But it seems so very disjointed because every single part is separate from each other. Jacob, Israel, is separated from his sons, the 10 that remained with him. And Joseph is separated by himself, and Simeon is in jail in Joseph's household. And you don't know what's happening in any one of their lives, and they are separated from each other. But God's symphony of worship comes together in this place so that the faith of all the individuals may be built. And our faith in God's sovereign plan can be grown and expand in worship and expand in glory, honor, and praise of what God is about to do. But yet each one of these people is an individual and separated from each other. And God's plan is to bring them together. But it takes time. It takes God working his work of healing in people's hearts and in their lives. It takes accountability. It takes correction. And it takes faith. And sometimes when we get in the middle of life, faith seems to take a back seat. See, that's what happened to Israel. That's what happened to Jacob in his life. He had faith that God would grow his family to a great number, and then he loses Joseph in the midst of a lie. And as his sons travel in the midst of famine, he loses Simeon to Egypt. And he's told, if you want your family to survive, give another son. Send Benjamin. So for that second journey, Jacob's indecision comes welling up. It comes bubbling to the surface. In chapter 42, we see Jacob being very decisive. Go, take money, get us grain, when all the brothers looked at each other and say, what should we do? But here Jacob falls into a position of desperation. He doesn't want to lose another son. He doesn't want his family to starve, but he doesn't know what to do. Israel's indecision at this point is a result of the toil of famine. That position where you struggle just to survive. That famine for our lives can be any number of things. It can be a position of just lack of funds. It can be a question of if we'll have a crop. It can be the question of where are our kids and what are they doing? Why haven't we heard from them? That desperation of living, that position where we don't know what's about to happen next, is exactly where Jacob fell. Where Israel rested, he got to the point of questioning God's plan and purposes for his family. What would it take for us to be in that position? When our faith is tested by life situations and we wonder what God's symphony even looks like because we feel so alone and so separated from everyone around us. What would we do? A lot of people have told me, well, I'll just stay home. You know, I'm in such a bad mood. I'm just going to stay home. I don't need Scripture. I don't need to be a part of the church. I'll just be separate, and it'll be okay. I've had people say that to me. Why didn't you notice that I wasn't around? And the problem was that we didn't know. Nobody recognized it. And the people who didn't say anything. And so that separation took place, and that desperation became deeper. And some people caught up in their sin to the point where they were ashamed, couldn't speak out, and go to another person because of fear of being judged or hurt by others. And then dealing with the loss of a loved one, the loss of position, the loss of a means to support your family, brings you to a point of desperation. And when that happens, when we get there, where do we turn? Israel said, we got to have food, but I don't like the plan. He looked at his sons and says, I don't like that I have to send Benjamin. He's the only one that I have left, so I'm going to hold him dear. But when the pain of his situation outweighed the pain of losing another son, he relented. He relented not to the desperation, but to the logic of Judah. You see, Israel struggled with his faith so greatly in this moment that he could not make the decision himself, and he had to turn to another. And Judah stepped up in the midst of that. He turned to his father and said, go back. He said, the man solemnly warned us not to go down and buy food without your son. And Judah turns to him and says, I will arise and go that we may live and not die, as well as you and our little ones. I myself, in verse 9, he says, will be surety for him. You may hold me responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame before you forever. His own son had to convince him that this was the right thing to do. And in the midst of our struggles with faith, we need somebody to come alongside us and say, I will stand with you. If your faith is not great enough, then trust me. Because my faith is greater. And my understanding of God's plan is greater than you can imagine. And when we struggle with our own faith, we need the church to come alongside of us. How often, though, when we struggle with faith, do we not want to tell anybody? How often when we struggle to show up to church, do we just say, you know what, I'll make it next week, and then next week becomes 2, 3 weeks, a month? Then you think about the relationships that we have with each other. How do we tell somebody that we're questioning what God's plan is? When we separate ourselves from the church, it's really hard for us to turn to each other and say, I wonder what God's doing. And it's hard for us to speak the truth in love and say, I may not know, but I'll join with you in prayer. And I'll trust God's plan is greater than our own. Judah's pledge was one of lending his faith to Israel. And we may need to lend our faith to one another. Israel is finally able to gain a little bit of strength. He's finally able to gather his thoughts together. And we see that he decides that now is the time to give gifts. He turns from his lack of faith to give gifts to his family because he does not know what would happen. And so he turns to his family and offers them a gift of wisdom. That gift of wisdom is one where he tells them, take some of the best products of our land and carry them down to the man as a present. Take double the gold and an extra portion for the grain you are about to buy. That little bit of wisdom serves his children well. And in his desperation, he still is able to apply the wisdom of God to preserve his family. He decides that we need to have enough wisdom to give a gift of blessing to the Lord that we will stand before. And in doing so, he subjects himself and his family to the will of the Lord. But he does so with a gift that matters to him. I remember many times getting to know some folks from the South. And as we would go and introduce ourselves, we would bring a little bit of sharp cheddar cheese and some Honeycrisp apples to share. Because when you bring the best of your land to a people who don't have it, people take notice of you. And perhaps that little gift would be enough to assuage the anger or frustration or the question of what's about to happen. That gift of blessing to the Lord really put Joseph in a position to accept things from his own father. His own father sacrificed of the things that he had in the midst of their desperation to give to the Lord a little something from home. What Jacob did not know was that Lord was his son. In the midst of this, there's a shift as well. Jacob stops talking about Benjamin as his son and starts talking about him as your brother. Take your brother with you. And in that simple statement, in that simple phrasing, one of Israel's gifts that he gives to his son in his desperation is the responsibility for one another. That ownership of the well-being of their brothers is turned over to them. It's almost as if Israel is saying, you know what? If you can't come back, we're all going to die anyways. Here's my blessing to you. Do the best you can with what you have. Either you'll die on the way, and we'll die here separately. But we have so much to live for. Perhaps God would let us live. This blessing, this prayer, in the midst of his desperation, was so great that he needed to turn it over to God, but he struggled to do so. It's so hard when we're struggling with our own faith and we're trying to play a song for God's glory in the midst of it, that we don't know what God's about to do. We've read the end of this story. We know that restoration is coming. But right now, in the midst of this true story of Israel's desperation, he is separated from everybody and expecting to die. And his blessing with his sons is perhaps you'll live if you just go. How often does fear beget fear? How often does our anxiety over what's happening next produce more anxiety and more fear and more wonder about the next thing that's about to happen? This next portion of Scripture deals with the fact that Israel's sons have made it to Egypt, and they are waiting to stand before Joseph again. And their anxiety from their father over their life and their living has continued to grow And their fear of death continues to grow. And their fear of condemnation for their silver and gold being returned in their bags grows greater and greater. As they go into the house, they wait. Now, Joseph was going about his everyday work. He was doing the things that he would normally do on a daily basis, going from town to town, administering the distribution of grain from the cities that Pharaoh owned. And as he's going about that business, he notices his brothers from afar and sees Benjamin specifically and turns to his steward and says, "Bring those men to my house. Slay an animal and make ready a meal, for they are to dine with me at noon." Joseph's faith remained. If we can say anything about Joseph, is that his faith remained steady even though he was far from his family, sold into slavery, imprisoned, awaiting death. And his faith remained, trusting God's promise through the dreams he received that 10 sheaves would bow down to him and 11 would lay themselves down. And now we see that happen. That Israel's sons were gathered in the same house together. All 12 gathered once more under the same household, eating a meal together around similar tables, though separated from one another. Joseph by himself, because he was a Hebrew. The Egyptians in his household separated from him. The Hebrews, Joseph's brothers, separated as well, all sitting down to have a meal together. This unusual invitation for foreigners to come into his homes allows us to understand exactly God's symphony of praise. And Israel's sons feared the unknown. They asked, "What is about to happen to us?" And that question is one that we often ask. What's happening next, Lord? What's going to go on here? What's going to happen so I can live? That next problem kind of distracts us from what God's doing. Have you ever noticed that? Whenever a problem pops up in my life, my first thought is, what can I do and how can I fix it? I often think about that problem, and in my own wits and in my own strength, I try to figure things out. I try to make things make sense and make them easy and make things easier. And so I try these solutions, but you know what happens in the middle of that? I take the focus off of God's glory and I put it right onto the problem. Have you ever noticed that? That when a problem crops up, it's hard to see what God's doing and how he's moving and acting. It's hard to give him glory in the midst of that struggle. And we look for solutions that will preserve our life or preserve our living or preserve the things that are about to happen. But we struggle to give God glory because we're so focused on the problem that we miss what God's about to do. Paul was pretty clear to us in 2 Corinthians 12. He was pretty clear to us in 2 Corinthians 12 because he had struggled with the same problem in his life so much that 3 times he prayed that God would deliver him from it. But he realized that perhaps God had a plan for it. And he writes in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10, he writes of what God spoke to him after he had prayed 3 times. He says, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Because God shows up in our weaknesses. And God brings the church alongside of us. And he brings people into our lives to support and encourage us, to extend their faith, to build us up, to create this symphony of worship together, so that when we need to rest, the music would not stop. And God would receive the glory forever and ever. The easy question that we have, and that we often answer, is, do we trust God with our life and our living? We can answer that question pretty easily. We can say, God's given me faith for life and living. The harder question becomes, do you trust God with your death and with your eternity? So often we think about eternity as being that thing that will happen once we die. But it's right now. Do we trust God with whatever may come tomorrow? In Philippians 1:21 through 26, Paul said, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. And I do not know which to choose. But I am hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again. Paul had an eternal perspective of a temporal life. Think about that. An eternal perspective of a temporal life. Do we have enough faith to trust God with eternity? Are you willing to trust him right now with it? When fear, when anxiety, when the unknown is about to come up, will you turn that eternity over to him? Can you imagine the brothers sitting down early one morning and being brought into Joseph's household, and they talk to the steward, and the steward assuages their fear? So often, when we question God's plan, we look for solutions ourselves. But God's plan is so much greater than our own. And he may have us go through things for reasons that we don't know, so that the symphony of worship that's produced from it would be pleasing in his ears. The problem with questioning God's plan, though, is that we tend to focus on our own situation. We tend to work things out in our own strength. And what we really need to do is gather together as his church and turn in faithful worship to a faithful God whose plan is for all eternity. Because his eternal plan is salvation for all those who would call upon his name. When the house steward is approached, the brother's fear was assuaged. He said, I've already received all the payment for the grain that you've given. Perhaps your God placed it in your bags.